Warm greetings to everyone in the audience here in the Syed Event Room 5 at COP29 in Baku, but also online. Thank you all for joining us for this side event on just transitions, a fairness discourse for enhancing adaptation and improving social resilience. We are still waiting for the minister to join us, but in the meantime, I think we should just start this session now. My name is Petra Binnerob. I am Professor of International Law at Durham University and the Director of the Center for Sustainable Development, Law and Policy. I will start with a few introductory remarks on just transitions to set the scene and then introduce our panelists. And I feel very lucky that we have this range of expertise and thought leadership here in the room today in the panel, but also in the audience, of course. Now, thought leadership at COPs is more important than ever. This COP was opened with remarks about oil and gas as gifts of God. I'm not going to comment on this statement. However, the discussion about this statement should not distract us from the reasons why we are here at COP. COPs have a very concrete mandate, and that mandate is spelled out in Article 7 of the Convention. And it applies also to the Paris Agreement, of course. Among other things, COPs shall do the following: periodically examine the obligations of the parties and the institutional arrangements under the Convention, the obligation of parties, and assess on the basis of all information made available to them in accordance with the provisions of the Convention, the implementation of the Convention, the overall effects of the measures taken pursuant to the Convention, in particular environmental, economic, and social effects, as well as their cumulative impacts and the extent to which progress towards the objective of the Convention is being achieved. So this COP should do exactly that and pay close attention to the latest reports. It should consider the UNEP-GAP report, the IPCC reports, and the NDC synthesis report prepared by the Secretariat and released on the 28th of October 2024. COP must be directed by science. Reviewing legal obligations of states must be informed by science. These reports, allow me to briefly summarize, conclude that we have the following shortfall. Total global greenhouse gas emissions, taking into account implementation of all latest NDCs, we would see in 2025 54% higher emissions than in 1990, 11.3% higher than in 2010, and approximately the same as 2019. In 2030, emissions will be 49.8% higher than in 1990, 8.3% higher than in 2010, and 2.6% lower than in 2019. There is a possibility still that global emissions will peak before 2030, but the report of the Secretariat makes clear that the absolute difference in the level of emissions by 2030, according to the latest NDCs and these IPCC scenarios, will be sizable. The contribution of Working Group 3 to the AR6 concludes that in scenarios of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, with only a 50% likelihood by 2100, with no limited overshoot, will require reductions of over 40%, 43% by 2030 compared to 2010 levels. I think it's important to recall these facts sometimes. We can still choose a different pathway. In Sharm el-Sheikh, the first decision on the Just Transition Work Program was adopted. This work program provides a unique opportunity to reconceptualize mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage as the main pillars of just transitions horizontally and vertically to include communities in international and national processes. What do we know so far about these just transitions? There was unity, even in Dubai, that we need just transitions and that they must be fair and leave no one behind. The first decision was adopted at CMA 5, requiring parties to enter into dialogue and discussion for pathways to achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Among other things, these elements include discussion of pathways to achieve the Paris Agreement as outlined in Article 2 with all these goals, a just and equitable transition to include energy, socioeconomic, workforce, and other dimensions so as to mitigate potential impacts associated with the transition, recognizing opportunities but also challenges and barriers relating to sustainable development and poverty eradication as part of transitions globally to low emissions and climate resilience, just transitions of the workforce, creation of decent work and quality jobs, including through social dialogue, social protection, and the recognition of labor rights, participatory approaches, and international collaboration and cooperation. Again, this needs to be emphasized at each COP. Now, at this COP, as you know, negotiations in the SIPSTA have not concluded with an agreed text. And now the hope rests for the second week of this COP with the CMA to sort this out. We cannot afford, in the light of the science, to become tangled in procedural detail and lose sight of the science that indicates urgency, the climate crisis. We are in Azerbaijan, the land of fire. We can see around us how much nature has to offer, and we see the potential of destruction in all countries of the world, including through using nature's powers and gifts to destruct this planet and hand it over in that state to our children and future generations. The concept of just transitions offers an alternative to our current trajectory. It offers even more than that. It provides a new alternative and narrative for our world. We can use this to think outside the box. There is a possibility of a different world, but we must allow the Just Transition Work Program to imagine and nurture it. So how can we do this? First and foremost, it is critical to bring women and youth more to the center of just transitions to lead societies into a sustainable, equitable, and fairer future. Women represent not only half of the world's population, they also educate the next generation. Their choices and knowledge defines all our futures, but we must enable them to choose. Now, the draft negotiating text that will be considered during this week by the CMA can open the Paris Agreement to include important facets that have roots already in the Convention. A few highlights that are already in the text and that should remain are the following. Parties are urged to consider just transition pathways in developing and implementing their NDCs, their NAPs, and their LEDs. They must be aligned with the outcomes of the first global stocktake and the relevant provisions of the Paris Agreement, recognizing that this can facilitate more ambitious action. There's emphasis on the inherent connection between pursuing efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, including through deep reductions, emission reductions. Calling on Decision 1 CMA 5, the global stocktake decision, where it was recognized that parties are not yet collectively on track towards achieving the purpose of the Paris Agreement and its long-term goals. And also recognizing that just transitions are relevant not only in the context of mitigation, but also in the context of adaptation to strengthen climate resilience. Now, this, of course, is all embedded in a wider discourse in many different perspectives. The term just transitions had its roots in the work of the International Labour Organization. As we know, it has been linked to the energy transition, which is narrower. This new program under the Paris Agreement can be wider, and it can really bring new hope to these negotiations. I am now really looking forward to exploring the concept and what it could mean for ambition under the Paris Agreement with my colleagues in this panel. I will now introduce all speakers and would like to invite the Minister of Uganda, no, not arrived yet. Okay, to join the panel when she will arrive. So we are looking forward to seeing Honorable Ruth Nankabirwa Ssentamu, Minister of Energy and Mineral Development of Uganda, joining us hopefully in a few moments. We've got also the honor of having here Professor Laura Massiliani, Professor of Economics and a very dear colleague from Durham University. Professor Greg Walker, Professor of Environmental Sciences, Oregon State University. And then Ms. Danielle Yeo, Climate Policy Lead of the Center for International Law of the National University of Singapore. Emily Fain, the Net Zero Policy Manager at the British Standards Institution, BSI. And Ruta Trainit, International Environmental Communication Association. So I will invite now each of the speakers to give an up to 10-minute long statement, and then hopefully we can have some discussion with the audience as well. Thank you very much, and the floor is yours, Laura.
Thank you very much, Petra, and welcome everybody to this session. Petra has already introduced me. I'm a professor of economics, and I've been working for more than 30 years on issues related to environmental economics, but also energy transitions and everything to do with the global environmental challenges, such as the climate crisis and biodiversity loss crisis as well. Now, when it comes to the implementation and the economics of the implementation of any projects, including those in relation to climate mitigation and adaptation, and but also more widely net zero transition projects, it is well acknowledged that there is a tension between what we call economic efficiency and equity. We'll say more about this in a minute. So sometimes there is a trade-off. So one excludes the other. However, it doesn't have to be so. So it's very much up to the political will, as I will illustrate with one example here. The example I want to offer to you is that of the carbon market, right? And that is where this tension can be recognized. So when it comes to carbon markets, they've been very efficient in curbing emissions. Think about the European trading system. Emission has decreased steadily since its inception, 2005. So that has been achieved at the least cost. And this is what how we define economic efficiency. So reaching certain target at the least cost for society. And however, the equity issue has not been well addressed so far. And I thank Petra, the Center for Sustainable Development and Policy at Durham University, for organizing this session to address, this missing part of the puzzle. And I just want to tell you a little bit about how the cap and trade, the carbon market works, so that we can recognize this tension between efficiency and equity, right? So a target is fixed, and then permits will be allocated across, different stakeholders that have an interest in the carbon market and participating in the carbon markets. Think about firms and other entities, and a price will therefore emerge. Now, what we have seen since I said that in 2005, the inception of the European trading system, taking that as a very informative example, is that the cap has been decreasing steadily. This is good news. So less and less emissions should be generated. And that has given rise to higher carbon price. Right? So the carbon price is increasing. Now, how does that reflect on the equity dimension? Unfortunately, not in a positive light, because when the price of carbon increases, the poor households think about households, about the poor members of this society, are the ones that are disproportionately disadvantaged. And they are disproportionately disadvantaged on three main dimensions. The first one is that they spend a higher share of their income on energy. And if the price increases because of the carbon price in the market has increased, that is bad news for these households, right? So the second reason why they are disadvantaged by the increase in the carbon price is that they tend to work mostly in fossil fuel intensive sectors. So when it comes to the transition, they will be penalized on that front as well. And finally, when it comes to adoption of renewables, right, think about heat pumps, which is a fave in the United Kingdom, so on, they face high financial constraints. So they don't have access to borrowings as middle class or richer households have. Okay, so you can see that there is inequity issues there that need to be addressed. How do we address that? Now go back to the carbon markets mechanism. So when these permits for emitting are giving away, this is done in such a way that an auction is created. When an auction is created, there will be some revenues accruing to the member states for allocating these permits, and the way in which we can use this revenue, the auction revenues, is crucial to determine a just transition, to make sure that the households that have been penalized by higher prices, that means higher efficiency, economic efficiency, will somehow be compensated for this loss that they will face. And when it comes to revenue for auctioning these permits, we're thinking about billions here. We're talking about billions. And in particular, Germany is the country that's raising more auctioning revenues. So you can think about the potential of using this revenue for just transition. It's huge. It's huge there. Now there is something very promising that has been happening in the, I would say, in the legal global framework, is the establishment of the climate social funds, and this was in 2023, sorry, and with the binding effect from 2026. And this will last until 2032. So this is a global climate social funds that wants to tackle these inequalities that we were talking previously. So by harnessing, the will of different member states, then there will be this pot of money that can be used towards climate, energy transition projects and other projects in a way that benefit those that have been left behind by this transition, the transition pathways. So here I want to make a proposal. I would like everyone who has executive power in the audience, but also in the COP29 in general, to look at how to link the climate social fund to the trading system, to the carbon markets, in particular the European trading system that, as I said, is very proactive in addressing not only the efficiency concern, but also the equity concerns of carbon markets. So by using these auctioning revenues through the climate social funds for projects that brings more equality and less impact of transitions on poor households, we actually can achieve both the efficiency goal and also the equity goal of carbon trading. And just want to spend a couple of minutes telling everybody that we have an exciting project at Durham University called Just Now, Just Transition to a Net Zero World that is actually trying to tackle these issues in harnessing the potential of several disciplines: law, computer sciences, biosciences, and economics, to design this kind of carbon markets that can achieve the goals of efficiency and equity at the same time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laura. And I hand over to Greg Walker. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. My name is Greg Walker. I'm a professor at Oregon State University in the U.S., and I'm here with the International Environmental Communication Association, as well as Mediators Beyond Borders International. In truth in advertising, I am on the Faculty of Environmental Sciences, but my academic home is in the School of Communication. And it's about communication that I'm going to share a few ideas. And I'm going to start my little stopwatch here so I keep track of, well, maybe I'll start it. So I keep track of how long there we go. Let me ask you all a question. My guess is that many of us in this room, perhaps all of us, have traveled some internationally. I want you to imagine a country, a municipality, or a village that you visited that has gone through an abrupt change. It could be a catastrophic weather event, damage the local economy. It could that government policies change the economic base of that community. In other words, in those cases, people are faced with abrupt changes for which they may not have done much planning. And to me, that's where the concept of just transition, at least in my work, becomes so important. What I want to do is share with you some ideas on communication related to just transition. Now, I should tell you that I have all of this material I'm going to share with you in a set of slides, and I'm happy to share those slides with you. If you're interested in getting a copy of them, you just let me know and we'll get those to you. I want to start with the concept of participatory communication. This is a concept I learned about during the Millennium Development Goal years, and I ran across the work of Ramirez and Quarry, Richard Ramirez and Wendy Quarry, and they wrote wonderful work on this idea of participatory communication. And what they basically said was participatory communication covers a wide range of communication functions that cross the development spectrum, such as information, public relations, social marketing, community voice, and so on. Now, I want you to think about that as you look at what's on the narrative for this event. We have the last line. Our theory of change is that just transitions depend on the empowerment of women and youth to lead societies into sustainable, equitable, and fair future. I would modify that slightly to say empowering every interested party, men, women, children, old, young, who have an interest in this idea of just transition. But I also want to share with you a definition of just transition that I particularly like that comes from the Sierra Club and the Just Transition Alliance. They write that just transition is a principle, a process, and a practice. And I'm going to refer to the practice component at the end. They say that, and the practice of just transition means that the people who are most affected by pollution, the frontline workers and fence line communities, should be in the leadership of crafting policy solutions. So how do we do that? How do we provide people with opportunities to be empowered related to the changes that occur in aspects of their lives, whether it's at a national government, whether it's at a municipality, whether it's a local village, whether it's a business, or whether it's a non-government organization, whatever that might be? Well, when I think about that, I think that we need to emphasize participatory communication as a way of providing people with opportunities to have a voice on matters of just transition, regardless of scale or regardless of scope. Now, I want to share with you, I've been doing work for over 30 years on collaborative community engagement, and mainly in the United States, a little bit in Northern Europe. And I've been asked by people, What are the principles that guide meaningful participation, meaningful participatory communication? And my colleagues and I came up with the mnemonic of faith. This is for those of you that may be interested, this is FAAITH. Now you think about this for a moment, related to, again, the principles of locally led adaptation, or what we know to be meaningful just transition. The F stands for fairness, and we have the fairness discourse in international law as the first statement in our narrative for this session. The second one is accountability. The third is access, providing people with access, opportunities to have their voices heard. The I is for inclusion. In other words, we need to be very ambitious in including as many different parties and voices as possible. The T, won't surprise you, is for transparency. And the H is for honesty. Now add all that up. F for fairness, A for accountability, A for access, I for inclusion, T for transparency, H for honesty. Now, if we adhere to all of those principles, what happens? People trust one another. Trust emerges, people trust the process, and they believe that their voices are heard. And the research on procedural justice, for example, is pretty compelling, that people will support decisions that are different than their preferences if they had a voice in the crafting of that decision. And so that's part of this idea of just transition. Now, to get at this idea, my colleagues and I have come up with something that we call the 4D pathway. 4D pathway of participatory communication related to locally led adaptation, related to just transition, related to community empowerment on climate action. Now, the 4D pathway, if you can imagine this about your own lives and the communities you live in and the issues that matter to you locally, to you, your families, your professional colleagues. The 4D pathway means this, that when we involve people from a communication perspective in projects of just transition or projects of locally led adaptation, it starts with the first D, which is discovery. Really trying to understand the dynamic. I tell the story that about a decade ago, I spent 3 weeks in central Ghana. And I was working with a university there, and we went out and we visited a number of villages affected by mining. And this is mining that interests that were coming to a great extent from the United States. And the problem was that these mines were going to run out at some point. And at that point, the communities didn't know what they were going to do. And we proposed a process that, of course, we did not get funded for it, but we proposed a process that started with discovery. And so we went out into these small communities in the Ashanti region of Ghana, and we simply talked with people, not just the elected people. We talked with the chiefs of the traditional areas. We talked with the elected officials. But one of the most influential people we met in one of the villages was a beautician. And she was so knowledgeable about the local community. So we do that discovery phase where we really need to do assessment. And that leads us to dialogue. And we know about dialogue here at COPS, the Talanoa dialogue. There are other events going on using the term dialogue. And dialogue is very much a non-judgmental peer learning opportunity. Sharing our knowledge, asking our questions. And the third D then is deliberation, where we roll our sleeves up and we have to set priorities. We have to allocate resources. We have to argue constructively and share ideas in order to make better decisions. And the fourth D, of course, is making that decision. So imagine if we have a just transition initiative that is going to empower local people, and we take them through discovery, dialogue, deliberation, and ultimately decision-making where their voices really matter. Now, in the slides I have, and I'm not going to belabor it because it's a lot of detail, but I'm happy to share with you, what we've done is create modalities for each of those 4 Ds. In other words, there are so many different tools that we can use to empower people. And it means they're highly interactive, they're peer learning opportunities where, in effect, everyone in the room has the opportunity to contribute their own kind of wisdom, their indigenous knowledge, their scientific and technical knowledge that might have come from some university, all of which really matter to empowering local voices to play a meaningful role in just transition. And again, I appreciate the opportunity for you to share those ideas. Happy to share those slides with you. But I'll simply conclude this way, that whether we're doing a process of the 4 Ds or whether we're adhering to the principles of faith, the bottom line is that there's a human dimension to just transition. It's in the Sierra Club statement. It's in the World Resources Institute comments on just transition. And there's a technical dimension and a non-technical or human dimension to really every just transition initiative that I think we need to address as we encounter and work through the climate crisis. So thank you very much for the opportunity to share these ideas.
Thank you very much, Greg. And now I've got the great honor to introduce Honorable Ruth Nankabirwa Ssentamu, who is the Minister of Energy and Mineral Development in Uganda. Thank you so much for joining us in your busy schedule. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I would like to observe protocol. Having come late, I don't know who is here, but you are all important people and colleagues with whom we are fighting to make sure that we get just transition. My apologies for coming in late. I've just jumped out of the plenary session, which is still going on, but I left when G77 had contributed. First of all, I want to thank the Durham University and the International Environmental Communications Association for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak. Communication is very important. Speaking is one thing, but to communicate and be understood is very critical, and therefore appreciate. We highly uphold our partnership with Durham University and appreciate the support accorded to us by the team through our collaboration, which enhances our strengths to better managing our potential impacts from our oil and gas activities. Uganda discovered commercial oil in 2006, and from there, we trained our experts to make sure that we really abide by the requirement of environment and other social issues. The Durban team supported us with improvement in some of our energy policies, including a review of the draft Uganda petroleum policy with focus on addressing climate change aspects. For example, the developers in upstream are aware that Uganda does not accept flaring of gas, neither do we accept venting of the gas. We also take critically the issue of national content, so that the Ugandan people can benefit from getting the jobs, but also on technology transfer. Durham University has also supported the Ugandan team to share the Uganda's oil and gas sector, how we are doing to manage the potential climate impacts. We thank you so much. Let me also talk about Uganda's vulnerability. Uganda, like any other country in Africa, I think, we rely on firewood and charcoal in cooking, almost 80%. Uganda used to be very clean, but the forest cover is getting lost every year because of search for cooking fuel. And this is firewood and charcoal. As I speak now, even firewood and charcoal is becoming expensive because it's becoming scarce. People are guarding jealously their forests because they've come commercial forests for timber. So this leaves our social communities with no solution. And we've been receiving testimonies from people who have suffered because of indoor pollution due to the cooking methods that we are encountering. So efforts to address indoor air pollution should be made to protect the vulnerable people with a special focus on local and underprivileged women and children. So the exposure of the vulnerable women and children needs to be reduced with dedicated and targeted policy interventions. We are now implementing the burning of charcoal in one part of the country, but we are being asked of the alternative. So that's why we are focusing on the upstream developments from our petroleum resources, because our resources come with associated gas. And we expect to replace, at least to replace charcoal and firewood with gas. Much as gas is not clean, but at least is cleaner than charcoal and firewood. So energy access is being enhanced. Last mile connection is quite challenging because it involves a lot of investment. And so we are coming up with other alternatives where you can get access to cleaner energy without you being on the national grid. So our priority as a country is to deploy several interventions like cooking stoves, energy cooking stoves. Much as you could be using charcoal or firewood, but we also want to begin by reducing the energy, the amount of energy you need to prepare a meal, regardless of what source you are using. Because energy transition, if it is to be a just transition, it should not be abrupt. You need to give time people for adaptation, first of all, and also as you prepare to transit them into the clean energy, you must put provisions which are acceptable. So we think that by coming up with energy or cooking stoves, energy saving cooking stoves, and LPG gas cylinders with associated accessories is one way of making a just transition for most of our communities. Recently, we signed an off-taker agreement, supply and purchase agreement with Global Gases Group, where government has donated land, 10 acres, for manufacturing, for construction of a gas cylinder manufacturing facility. And we have committed ourselves as government to purchase 500,000 gas cylinders with associated accessories for donation to the communities as part of the adaptation process. This will call for 30 million US dollars every year, and the agreement goes for 10 to 12 years. We think that during this period, people will adapt, transiting from charcoal, from firewood, to at least accept gas. People fear using gas. They see it as a danger. And our community setup is different from that of Europe, where homesteads are connected to a national gas pipe system, where you just lock in. In Uganda, you construct your house and you find your own way of getting access to a gas cylinder. You actually move a gas cylinder from one home to another. In Europe, there is that infrastructure where you have taps for gas. So this is a commitment from my government to see 30 million US dollars every financial year going into gas cylinder. On top of other arrangements, we are working with government of UK on clean cooking to get access to electricity cooking pressure cookers, which we have been donating, and I would like to call upon colleagues or partners for more intervention, because we see this as one way of saving our forests that work as carbon sinks. When forests disappear, then we will not be talking about climate mitigation. Those of you who were in COP28 in Dubai, you might have come across information about Uganda's energy transition plan. We launched that plan and we are emphasizing energy access. The good thing is that Uganda's national grid is supplied by renewables, almost 100%. There is only one plant which generates 50 megawatts. It is a standby security plant which uses HFO, but we are also in process of converting it from using HFO to using gas, natural gas. Otherwise, the rest of the energy mix in Uganda is renewable, from hydropower, from wind, from sun, solar energy. So our energy transition plan targets generating 52,481 megawatts by 2040. This energy will be able to power the electricity vehicle policy. We have started manufacturing electric cars in Uganda. We now want to partner with people to help us establish charging stations for the motorcycles, charging stations for the electric cars that have started coming in the country, but also we've started producing buses and small cars. So in our energy transition plan, we are targeting to exploit all the possible sources of energy: hydropower, solar, wind. We have potential from geothermal, 1,500 megawatts. We have done the feasibility study. The projects are ready for investment. I'll talk about nuclear energy, where we have potential to generate 24,000 megawatts, and 2 sites have been identified. We are carrying out the feasibility study. So the energy transition plan calls for more support, but it is a move in the right direction. You will see Uganda transiting slowly. Why are we exploiting our petroleum resources? It's because we are looking at it as a source of income, a source of funds. And actually, we established a petroleum fund, which is ring-fenced for infrastructure development. Part of the infrastructure development is the electricity infrastructure. Right now, we have generated power which we are not consuming, some of which we are not consuming. Not because we don't want it, not because our access is 100%, but it's because we lack the distribution network. We lack money to invest in the distribution network to see the last mile connection. We have 9,000 megawatts of renewable not being utilized. And so under our East African power pool, we've decided to trade this power to our neighbors, those that can use it, as we plan to expand our distribution network. We trade with Kenya, we trade with Rwanda, we trade with Tanzania, we trade with South Sudan. Those are our neighbors. But we need this power because our energy access now is 60%. That means that 40% of our population is still in darkness. We need this power, but instead of having it, paying for it without using it, we are better off sharing it with our neighbors. So we come together to work on infrastructure to transport this power so that our neighbors can utilize it. So we beg for your understanding why we are involved in fossil fuel. It's not because we want, it's because we see it as source of funds, because nobody will offer the amount of money which you want to invest in energy transition. We are here at COP29. We are anxiously waiting for the outcome. Where is the money that was committed? Has it come through? Where is money for adaptation? What are the LDCs saying? We need to be understood and we need to be taken as such. So I'm so happy to join you this mid-afternoon, afternoon or morning, I even don't know, this afternoon to share with you what the Pearl of Africa is doing. Exploitation of our natural resources, but bearing in mind the requirement of the climate issues. We are doing afforestation through our national oil company to replace the trees that have been cut down. And we are doing all sorts of programs to make sure that we make up. Net zero will be achieved through concerted efforts. and we beg that we are understood. Let me stop here by thanking you for the opportunity and welcoming you to come and visit Uganda, the Pearl of Africa. Come and enjoy the snow on the equator and enjoy the climbing gorillas and the lions there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Minister, for this very powerful speech indeed. And I've got now the pleasure to hand over to Daniel Yeo from the Center of International Law at National University of Singapore. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I hope you can hear me. And thanks very much for the invitation, and also to Minister for the very inspiring message. And I really appreciated the comments by the other, by Laura and by Greg. And let me just start. I mean, my comments today shift a little bit of the focus. We'll be focusing on just transitions, but in the context of critical energy transition minerals, which I think is a key part of this equation and what that means. But let me just start with some comments from Simon Steele, where he mentioned that the just transitions means different things to different people, depending on who they are and where they live. And I think that's very important. One thing is certain, however, that we cannot and we will not leave those with less power and marginalized groups out of the picture. Solutions to the climate crisis are meant to be inclusive. And I do think this rather short statement captures all the comments that have been made so far in regard to this no one-size solution fits all, as Petra also mentioned. So in this context, I think, wanted to share that there's also a need, therefore, to think about, we talk about just transitions, what does it mean? What does a solution require? And do we need to customize it depending on which sectors we're even talking about? Because it's so complex. And those intricacies can be lost if we see everything as one, say, amorphous, homogenized picture. So that's quite different. So looking at just transitions, why am I talking about that today? That's really linked to the critical role of critical minerals, to the just transitions, to the energy, to green technologies, from EVs to solar power panels to everything like that. And as Petra mentioned, the just transition will require a huge increase in the amount of renewable energy, to tripling of that. And to get that into place, according to the IEA's Global Mineral Outlook of 2024, the mineral demand for clean energy technologies will double from today and to 2030 in a steps sort of scenario. But when you think about the net zero scenario, the demand will treble as well. So where are those minerals going to come on from, and what does it actually mean? So the starting point is COP28, of course, right? Parties agree to triple the global renewables energy capacity and to double energy efficiency by 2030. And to achieve this, you need sufficient, reliable, affordable supply of these transition minerals as well. These are essential components of the clean energy technologies. Now, of course, this means that countries which are resource rich, many of these are located in developing countries, right? And the LDCs, these offers tremendous economic opportunities for these countries that possess such resources, and to generate prosperity, to eliminate poverty, and to drive sustainable development, which is a very key component. However, the transition of this magnitude can also bring substantial challenges. And why do I say that? Because the nature of mining itself, right, has been linked to pollution, has been linked to environmental degradation, human rights abuses, and certainly adverse impacts on the interests of local communities, indigenous peoples as well, because often the lands are the ones that are affected by such minings. A second point to that is that many developing countries also lack the capacity to refine and to process these minerals. So what this means is that they end up at the bottom of the mineral supply chain. So don't derive the benefits as fully as they could have. According to UNCTAD, UNCTAD estimates that the commodity dependence, which can actually hinder economic development and perpetuate inequalities and vulnerabilities, affects some 66% of small island developing states, 83% of LDCs, and 84% of landlocked developing countries. So that's really a huge number. So therefore, there is a real need to properly manage this supply chain, to properly manage the mining of these minerals, to avoid perpetuating this commodity dependence. And that also brings very much to this point about what does just transitions mean, therefore, in this sector. So it is really, therefore, in the context of this backdrop, and in response to developing countries' call for action, that the UN Secretary General established this panel on critical energy transition minerals. And this was set up in April of 2024. And there was a special event just on this panel discussion just last week. And I don't know how many of you were able to catch that, but it was a very good discussion on this panel and this report. And what this panel was asked to do is to develop a set of global and common voluntary principles on issues which are key to building trust between governments, communities, and industry, to enhance transparency. The point was raised earlier. Enhance investments. Again, this point was raised earlier. And how do you and to ensure just and equitable management of sustainable, responsible, and reliable supply chains for terrestrial critical energy transition minerals. So this is really the background, which I thought was very relevant to our discussions today. As the UN Secretary General himself said, the world powered by renewables is a world hungry for critical minerals. And so for developing countries, critical minerals are a critical opportunity. They create jobs, diversify economies, and dramatically boost revenues, which are necessary for many other things, right? But only if they are managed properly. And so the race to net zero cannot trample over the poor, and the renewables revolution is happening, but we must guide it towards justice. And that's, I think, is a very important clarion call. So let me just quickly jump to the panel's recommendations. And what did it say? The panel issued a report on 11th of September this year, resourcing the energy transition minerals to guide critical energy transition minerals towards justice and equity. It's a mouthful, but it does capture what it's trying to achieve. The panel came up with 7 guiding principles and 5 actionable recommendations that aim to foster trust, justice, equity, diversified supply chain, as well across the entire transition minerals value chain. So it's a very ambitious endeavor, but I do think it's a very important endeavor. And collectively, what they seek to do is to empower communities, to create accountability, and ensure that clean energy drives equitable and resilient growth, which includes advancing efforts to ensure maximum value is added in resource-rich developing countries. And what is interesting that the panel was actually drawn, reflects a very good multi-stakeholder inclusive approach, as Greg mentioned, from governments across the region, from NGOs, including multilateral development banks as well, the World Bank, and a number of IOs. Of course, the International Energy Agency would have been one of those who were also included, but it included representatives from indigenous communities as well. So that's very, very wide, broad-based consensus report, if I could describe it in that way. And the panel looked at existing principles, right? In human rights, for example, obligations which parties already committed to. So drawing from existing principles, laws, norms, and even political commitments, which were some of these 7 guiding principles. And I'll just run through them very quickly. Principle 1, human rights must be at the core of all mineral value chains. Second principle, integrity of the planet, environment, and biodiversity must be safeguarded. 3, justice and equity must underpin the mineral value chains. 4, development must be fostered through benefit sharing, value addition, and economic diversification. 5, transparency, accountability, anti-corruption measures are necessary to ensure good governance. And finally, again, this point was mentioned by Petra, multilateral and international cooperation must underpin global action and promote peace and security. The panel went on to give 5 actionable recommendations to operationalize and to support these principles. First is to establish an expert advisory group to facilitate a multi-stakeholder dialogue to accelerate this critical energy transition mineral value chain towards equity. right? And the purpose, of course, is to develop principles and recommendations that will achieve the objective of benefit sharing, diversification, trade investment, fiscal policy even, so on and so forth. The second is to launch a multi-stakeholder process and to develop, and this is what I found quite interesting, a global traceability, a transparency, and accountability framework across the entire value chain, from mining to recycling. And it could serve even as a system for disclosures, for due diligence, for data collection, so on and so forth. Recommendation 3 is to establish a global mining legacy fund. And this actually seeks to strengthen the financial mechanisms to build trust, to deliver justice that will address legacy issues due to abandoned derelict mines. So there's some parallel there when we talk about depleted mines, or that was also just mentioned. 4 talks about empowering artisanal and small-scale farmers towards responsibility. And the 5th is to looking at things like material efficiency and circularity targets to balance consumption and to reduce environmental impacts. So they're quite extensive, they're quite comprehensive in nature. But let me just, given the focus of this panel, also drive down to talk a little bit more about those principles and which are particularly relevant to empowering women and children, women and youth rather. All right, I don't know how much time I have, but very quickly, unpacking principle 1, when we look at human rights at the core of all the mineral value chains, and we talk about this will definitely include notions of principles in CEDAW, which is Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, principles under the Convention on Rights of the Child. These are all foundational, and also those under the ILO core conventions on labor rights as well. So these are foundational and very important to assess those principles and rights where they relate to women and children and youth. And this includes, for example, issues like implementing existing human rights and labor rights law, applying credible industry standards, which is, I think, the point that Emily was talking about, performing human rights due diligence, impact assessment, engagement, as Greg mentioned, with everyone affected in the process. Principles 3, when it talks about justice and equity, it talks about championing the gender equity and respect for the rights of women, girls, and gender and diverse people throughout the mineral chain to ensure good job opportunities, fair benefits and treatment, and engagement with all groups. So that, I think, goes to the point of empowerment. Principle 4, when it talks about fostering development through benefit sharing, value addition, this makes sure that the benefits actually flow down to all who are involved in this process. So when we look about actionable recommendation 2, which is a process for disclosures and all that, it does include notions of free, prior informed consent, governance practices, which I think is particularly important as well. And in relation to the recommendations that is directed at artisanal and small-scale miners, the focus here is to enable them to become agents of transformation, to foster development, environmental stewardship, and human rights. And they would therefore support these artisanal and small-scale miners and who are committed to responsible practices to support them on a pathway towards formalization, diverting from situations where mining is actually illegal or even exploitative. Now, this initiative would address the specific challenges faced by women, children, and indigenous groups, right? So, I mean, that's kind of the summary. And I think the next question really is, what are the implications? What's the next step? And I think those will be very exciting points for future discussion. But what's happening next is that, the panel has been asked to sort of socialize governments to this. The UN itself is going to work through various UN agencies to implement these recommendations and principles. It's still very early days yet. As a reminder, this only came out in September, so barely 2 months old. But I think there's a lot of excitement on what they could potentially mean. But they would certainly involve many stakeholders in the conversation, businesses, governments, civil society groups of all sorts, to make the principles come to life, so to speak. So looking beyond, will we see this featuring either in this COP or future COPs? Will we see this in maybe plurilateral, like-minded initiatives or declarations? We don't know, but I'm sure it will happen, at least in some forms. So we're happy to leave the discussion for later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. Really interesting points. And as you said, just transitions can mean different things to different people. And I think this really ties in nicely now with the topic of the next speaker, Emily Fainter, who will talk to us about the role of standards and measurements and how reporting can contribute to just transitions. Looking forward to it. Emily, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have the unenviable position of standing between you and probably a well-deserved cup of coffee. So I want to be brief and I want to be to the point. And I'm actually going to start by talking about what I'd like you to do. I'll describe the action first, and then I'm going to explain why, but I'd like you to make a note of it. Those of you who've got notebooks, please write this down. If you have laptops, open a tab. This is very important because what we're going to talk about now is how we connect you and your expertise and your perspectives to these large multilateral systems of rulemaking and decision-making that are so crucial to a just transition. So what I'd like you all to do is I would like you to consider joining your country's national standards body. And in particular, I'm referring to the National Climate Standards Committee that your national standards body runs. So I would be remiss to not mention the excellent Ugandan Bureau of Standards while I'm on a panel with the minister, my counterpart in Uganda, and I sit in the British Standards Institution, which is the UK national standards body. And what I want you to think about as I speak is imagine almost every country in the world has a government-appointed national standards body. And that sounds very dry and technical, so I'm going to try and make it a bit more fun. The point of your national standards body is to represent your needs in the development of national and international standards. Now, that can be relevant for the thickness of water pipes or the quality of whiskey, but what we're talking about today is international standards on climate, which are developed through multilateral consensus-based processes. So imagine the UN, imagine the equivalent of the COP negotiations that are going on down the corridor from us, but imagine that it's a committee or a national delegation that you can join, and you can. And that is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So what do we mean by standards, and what role do they play in building trust and facilitating a just transition? Well, I mentioned already that the International Standard System, or you can refer to it as ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, is this network of government-appointed or government-recognized national standards bodies around the world. And I mentioned already that they develop international standards by consensus, and the point of those bodies is to convey the needs of business, civil society, policymakers, and so on through that international process. But standards alone are not enough to build trust and to deliver the just transition that we are all looking for, which is why they are supported by other accountability mechanisms in each country. Those are the accreditation services, the conformity assessment bodies, which is sort of a technical, possibly dry way of saying the people that do the checking to make sure those standards are being followed, and the people that make sure that those who do that checking are to be trusted, that they are not vulnerable to bribery, that they are competent, that if a company is audited for its sustainability practices, you can trust the audit and trust that that is credible and trustworthy. This is the inbuilt accountability system in most national economies called national quality infrastructure. But again, I don't want to be sort of overtly technical because I want this to be really action focused, and I want to make sure that every person here leaves this room today feeling empowered that they can actually participate, and I'll borrow that word from Greg, participate in these decision-making forums, because I love the point earlier about participatory communication. This is exactly what this is. Now, the role of international standards is to help scale action and make sure that we are governing the world effectively by consent. So we need to move away from top-down institutions, particularly those based in North America, Europe, for lack of a better term, global North countries that are writing rules or dominating rule-setting forums that are then imposed on the rest of the world. We need bottom-up inclusive governance, and that's precisely what the ISO system involves. So for those of you with laptops or phones, I encourage you to open a tab in your internet right now. If you go to iso.org/members, so iso.org/members, you will find the list of every national standards body around the world, and I hope that you can find yours. So if you are with the minister's team, if you are from Uganda, yours is the Ugandan Bureau of Standards. If you're from the UK like I am, it is the British Standards Institution, but you should find your country's body there. And you will find an email address in which you can, and a website link in which you can look at that page on how to join national committees. Now, most countries in the world have a National Environmental Management Committee or Climate Standards Committee or Greenhouse Gas Management Committee. The name can slightly vary country to country, but that is a body that you are eligible to join. And that means that you participate in the consensus and decision-making of that national standards body in that country's view in the development of international standards. So if you're a business and you think that there are standards that are constricting you or prohibiting you from making your transition, you think there are standards that are missing, or there are particularly high profile international standards under development right now, such as the ISO net zero standard, the international standard on net zero under development right now, that you want to join, you can apply to join that country's national committee and participate in the development of that text. It's like walking into the negotiations room and getting to sit at the table and being able to look over the text yourself and suggest what you think needs to be changed. That is what the multilateral international standard system can offer you. From a just transition perspective, I've talked about that bottom-up inclusive governance based on every country having a say, but we've also touched on really important points on this panel today, such as the role of women and of youth. Now, I'm in my 20s, just about still, so I'm going to claim the youth badge still. I think the UNFCCC says it's under 35, so I'm 28, so hopefully I can still stay in that bracket. And I am a woman, so these are not academic subjects for me. I'm not talking about this because I'm on a panel. I'm talking about this because this is me, and this is many of you as well. And I want you to think about processes that you wish you could have a seat at the table on. And I want you to think about the needle that you can move, the impact you can have if you enter forums that are not necessarily labeled for youth or for women. We mustn't just be in spaces that are youth spaces. I've been to youth events at this COP, which have been wonderful and restorative. But one of the key call to actions I've given in all of those rooms is don't just go to youth events. Don't just go to climate NGOs, go to bodies and institutions that don't necessarily have your name on it, because it means that you're not in those rooms. Now imagine, to again draw on Greg's point, imagine if we had this system of deliberation and decision making with all of these voices accounted for. My message to you is we can, and it's called the International Standard System, and it already exists. And all you need to do is make sure that you've joined that committee. And whether it's for you as an individual in this room, if you are not the right person, who do you know? Who in your networks? All of us here have national, maybe even international networks of colleagues, stakeholders, civil society groups. Who do you know who you think could move the dial in an international consensus process like this? Please have a think about that as we go through the Q&A section, because this is, again, not just a panel conversation. This is a direct call to action, and I want to make sure that everyone in this room either replies or thinks of someone they know who they can encourage to apply. And I'd be very happy to talk to anyone afterwards to help you with that process if you have any questions. Petra, I'll pause there, but I'd be very happy to go into more detail on some of those points in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily, for pointing these very concrete points of action out to us. And I'm actually delighted to say that we have joined BSI as the Center for Sustainable Development Law and Policy. So there will be a lot of documents to read, but it's very much worthwhile. So I emphasize what you've said here as well. Thank you so much. Now, I would like to turn now to a very concrete example, a case study from Lithuania, and would like to invite Ruth to speak to us about her experience. Thank you so much.
Okay. Yeah, it works. So thank you for having me here. I'm here as a member of IECA, a communication association, but I'm also here as an NGO representative. So I'm a member of Lithuanian Consumers Alliance and volunteer in Environmental Coalition in Lithuania. And also I'm an editor of Citizen Initiative, the climate news agency, Climate Reporters. We create articles, we write articles and send it to mass media to be published. So when my colleague, Professor Greg Walker, suggested discussing just transition, I thought, oh, actually it was 2 days ago. I thought, oh, what a coincidence. After returning from COP29 into Lithuania, I will be attending an NGO workshop focused on this very topic. So actually it will be the first workshop within Lithuanian NGOs on this topic. So in these workshops, we aim to bring experts to provide deeper insights into just transition, highlighting the current state of affairs. So far, NGOs have done relatively little work on this issue and are now looking to get more actively involved in that. So in the European Union, including, of course, Lithuania, the discourse around the climate crisis tends to be dominated by a problem-solving approach led by governments. This approach often emphasizes technological solutions and CO2 reduction, rooted in administrative rationalism, the idea that government experts and managers knows best. This mindset extends to the topic of just transition as well. For example, in Lithuania, just transition is primarily addressed at the legislative level. And as a result, it receives little attention in the media, and the general public only learns about it sporadically through fragmental news stories. Moreover, the groups involved in these discussions are quite limited. Yes, trade unions are more engaged and concerned about just transition, while NGOs, especially environmental NGOs, are only now beginning to explore the issue in greater depth. To give a clear picture, I will give you an example. So Lithuania, 2 years ago, has developed a territorial plan for just transition that identifies 3 regions heavily reliant on industries such as cement, fertilizer production, and oil refining. These industries are largest employers in their respective areas, with some providing jobs for up to 50% of the local population. The closure of these industries would significantly impact the well-being of these communities. And the mechanism for just transition operates as follows. The plan is created in a top-down manner, with companies expected to implement them voluntarily. So there is no enforceable mechanism to ensure compliance. Consultations are limited to business and government, excluding workers, communities, and NGO from the process. So this is one example from the Eastern Europe region. But this exclusion has several consequences. We have insights from European Environmental Bureau, and a report published by Bankwatch highlights key shortcomings in the EU's just transition mechanism. First, it is neither comprehensive nor long-term, focusing primarily on workers' rights while neglecting other demographic groups, such as workers' family members, women, seniors, or children living in affected regions. And second, it misses opportunities to use funding for fostering new environmentally friendly small businesses, for example, or other innovative ventures in these regions. So as a result, the current plans, especially in Eastern Europe, lack ambition and fail to encourage national institutions to think beyond preserving jobs. This narrow focus overlooks the broader potential of just transition to drive more inclusive and sustainable, and of course, more resilient regional development. Well, it is not too late to change the situation. As I said, NGO, we are already empowering ourselves by organizing workshops. So we understand that we need a shift from one-side communication, from governments know best, better or know best, to listening and both-side communication. What benefits we can bring to have fair and just transition process. Thank you.
Muta, you're more than welcome to take the minister's seat. She had to go to a press conference. Thank you so much. Thank you, in fact, to all panel speakers for very interesting and insightful presentations. I would like to ask and invite the audience, in fact, to ask questions. So if you have, or maybe you want to comment on one of the presentations, so please just come forward if you would like to ask something. Otherwise, or in the meantime, while you are thinking about something, I will ask a few questions myself, take this privilege as a moderator. So just reflecting on what we've heard here, we can see there are different ways of defining and conceptualizing just transitions, but we mustn't forget that they will all affect one another. So one just transition in one country will have an inevitable effect on the just transitions taken in other countries. So these are interlinked. I did think while we were going through these presentations, are we all creative enough? Or are we still stuck in our thinking about certain dominant narratives that this is, in fact, the best world that we can imagine? Maybe we need to step aside and really think outside the box and think about something else, a better world where we have more fairness and equitable benefit and burden sharing. And I would like to come back to the role of markets and ask Laura a question also in terms of this topic. What is your view? How would it be possible to bring women, to bring youth into this more traditional approaches of developing a carbon market? Do we need to have a higher proportion of female leaders in some of these businesses? What would be your answer to that? Enhancing the role of women to global carbon markets.
Indeed. Thank you, Petra. So something that came out last year from the Dubai convention was the gender stocktake. And so they were trying to quantify the impact of climate change, but also transition policies on the, women and girls. And that was staggering. So the impact of both pathway, the climate crisis, and also the transition will impact directly the women and girls. And something has to do, something has to be done very, very quickly. Now, we can take some lessons from less developed countries where there are initiatives at community level, right at the core of the community. Think about a village or a quarter in a city where women illustrate how they can somehow participate in the transition and also perhaps mitigate the negative effect on themselves. And relating to the Uganda minister about the scheme for clean cook stove, that is very much an example where this participatory action at the grassroots, that means at community level, can actually empower women and somehow pass on the good practices to one woman to the others, right? So, of course, top-down policies such as, I would say, quotas that you were suggesting are very welcome, very, very welcome. in all realms, and also included the climate discourse, but also grassroots actions at community level led by women who can be role models for others to come in and implement those. You know, they can be simple solutions, but they can make a big impact. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And before turning to Greg, I would actually like to go back to Emily and ask her, how does this play a role, this conversation with women and about their role in the BSI? How do you find that reflected in standardization processes?
To check, I understand, is the question, how do the role of women and girls factor into standardization?
To put it really bluntly, how do you measure it? Is it being measured? Can there be a just transition without certain measurement of women and female participation in the?
Well, I would say that it's common sense that absolutely not. I mean, and I don't answer that question from a BSI perspective because it's not just a UK one, but from an ISO one as well, an international one. So the way that the international standard system is governed is through a set of directives, which each country also then has to abide by when they enter the international consensus process. And one of the sort of the language in those directives is around inclusive and balanced stakeholder participation. And there has actually been a huge amount of work done in ISO on gender responsive standards as well. So I mentioned examples earlier about kind of really key targets like net zero, the ISO net zero standard under development, our adaptation portfolio. But actually, to give you a really real example, there's been so many examples of where car safety tests to test that a car would keep a passenger safe if it crashed have failed because the installations, the seat belt, the seat height, everything was designed around the proportions of a man. Where iPhones or phones in general, smartphones, the proportion of the handset has been designed around the proportions of the average man's hand. There's so many different examples of where standardization historically has failed to account for the role of women and for what women need, which as a reminder of the obvious is half of the global population. So to answer the question, Petra, yes, absolutely, it's critical. It's something that the international standard system is conscious of, but I don't know how well this expression in English translates, but you can only lead a horse to water. So while we can put in place all of these mechanisms and safeguards and governance to ensure that our standards are responsive to gender needs, also, this is a system based on consensus and on participation. So I make this call in particular to the women in this room about whether you have considered playing a role in standardization, because again, these processes rely on the input of those that join. And international consensus will reflect the consensus of those involved. I don't have the stats to mind about what the proportion is of men and women in standardization, but like most major global institutions, I think it's fair to say we can safely assume that it will be dominated by men. So we're working very hard to address that, but we cannot do it without you. So for those who are considering this, please come and talk to me at the end. And for those who maybe are connected to civil society organizations, to Women in Climate Action or Women in Your Profession organizations, do consider sharing the call to action today to get involved in international standards with them, because international standards will help govern how businesses operate with response to the climate crisis, but crucially, also these international standards will inform the policy and regulatory design around the world. And that is really going to be where governance starts to have teeth.
Thank you very much. And I think on top of that, we really need this solidarity, not only towards the greener planet, but also between women and also between gender. So really important points you're raising here. Now we are slightly running out of time, so I would like to take this opportunity to ask Greg for a final takeaway point from your point of view, because we have organized this session together. It was a real pleasure, but I would like to give you the opportunity to round up a final sentence, a takeaway message, please. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My reflection in listening to my colleagues up here is that just transition is a very complicated concept, but it's also a cross-cutting concept. It's also a relevant concept. And I think it's important then to think about how just transition plays out in terms of policy and practice, as I mentioned before, on various scales and various contexts. And as I listened to the last comments, I thought about how just transition practices like locally led adaptation need to be culturally responsive. That there is not one size fits all, and that's something all of us in this room know. So those are some of my takeaways from the excellent presentations, and I'm sure that if you grab any of us up here to ask questions or make comments or exchange cards, by all means, let's do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Also to the audience, I've got one last play to make, really. It's to take these messages that we discussed today here outside this room, because we cannot afford to speak in an echo chamber. We really need to share these views and the urgencies of the action and the need for action really with everyone in this world. So we need to provide this information more widely. And thank you for supporting us. Thank you for coming here. It was a great pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you.